Welcome to another episode of Open World Chat. I'm your host, John Odom. My co-host, Jim Dandino, is off doing whatever Jim Dandino does when he's not here. But he will be joining me later for a more detailed, shall we say, genre discussion of the whole concept of the antihero. And for that to get us going, I'm going to be joined right now by novelist, biographer, and University of Vermont English professor Philip Baruth, who I would not be doing you justice if I didn't mention that you are also a Vermont state senator. So thank you for being here.
Absolutely.
So you are the most qualified person to know that I can think of to talk about the subject of antiheroes, because it's hot now in the genre world. You hear that term thrown around a lot in the context of the new Black Panther movie, the Black Adam movie. It's all about that now, but I'm not confident that the fanboys and the fangirls out there know what they're talking about when they use this term and they toss it around. Just like I don't think they know what they're talking about when they use the word mythology to talk about superheroes. And yes, I went there, but we'll go to that in another episode. So Philip, why don't you just tell us what an antihero is?
I'll tell you what my thoughts on an antihero are. I think anybody who goes to the dictionary for the definition is going to be misled in a horrible way. And I'll tell you why. So if you go to the dictionary, it says that an antihero is a central protagonist who lacks some or all of the qualities we normally associate with a hero. Now, if you think about that, it's defining it completely in terms of absence. Like an anti-hero just lacks heroism. And that's not it at all. What we're really talking about with an anti-hero is a character that does possess charisma, does possess extraordinary abilities, is not perhaps equipped with or burdened by the morality that we tend to associate with Hollywood heroes in the golden age. So if you take somebody like Hannibal Lecter, Anthony Hopkins won an Academy Award for portraying that character. We tend to think of Academy Awards as going to films that we like, portrayals that we find admirable in one way or another. And I think that's true of Hannibal Lecter. There's a sense in which, in addition to eating people, in addition to brutally murdering people, with malice aforethought, he is also catching a killer, helping the FBI, and in the process, displaying this sort of panache that people really were intrigued by. And I think from there, you get a whole raft of other kind of anti-hero serial killers like Dexter and others. So I think of the anti-hero as, in some ways, coming to full flower in America. We like anti-heroes more than we like heroes. So, I think the ratio is about 90-1. For every Mel Gibson in Lethal Weapon, where he has his badge taken away and his gun taken away, and he's kicked off the force, but he ultimately catches the criminal. For about 90 of those, we have one true blue moralistic hero like Captain America. And I think that's why Captain America has been a hit, because you don't see many like it. We tend to like Deadpool and, other characters who are anti in a way that's anti-establishment as well as anti-hero.
Right, which is also sort of the Star Trek appeal that they folks don't fit in that mold. And I just say that because we're required to mention Star Trek every episode. It's just worked out that way.
I would point out one of my favorite episodes, and everybody I know, one of their favorite episodes, is the one where the ore gets on the transporter and Kirk gets broken in two, and you actually have an evil Kirk where he goes down to the cafeteria and eats whatever he wants and does whatever he wants, says whatever he wants. Uh, Kirk always had a little bit of that, but seeing it amped up in that way just sort of shows you where his attraction really lies.
Well, you know, this is really because, okay, Hannibal Lecter, I would never have thought to go there, but the way you put it, you're absolutely right. And Dexter didn't even occur to me, but that one seems a lot purer and more obvious. He is the hero of the show. You know, the one that I always go right to when I try to think of anti-heroes is the Godfather series, or at least the first one.
Yeah.
I don't know if we're really rooting for Michael so much by the end of the second one, but that first
Oh,
one,
I am.
clearly, you are.
This is my offer. Nothing. Not even the $25,000 for the license, which I would appreciate if you put up personally.
Mhm.
When he gives that speech, I'm just like with him 1,000%.
But then when we finally lose him, and in the end of Godfather 3, it feels like, you know, this was his reward. So it's some at some time in that series, did he lose that status and become just give in to the ante? Did he just become a bad guy, or is it just a tragedy?
Yeah. And there's also the question of, after enough sequels, does any anti-hero get drained of the ante? Because it's hard to portray someone as anti-establishment, anti-mores, anti-codes that regularly. Rocky 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It became a joke. Same with Rambo, partially because you can't see somebody come back for the money that often and still think of them as somebody who's genuinely fighting the system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I'm curious. Have you seen it? Because I'll speak of this as an example of why it's coming up so much. But have you seen the Black Panther Wakanda Forever yet?
No, I saw the first one, but I haven't yet seen the sequel.
Well, let's talk about that first one then, actually. So I won't give away anything in the sequel, except to say, you know, if you're familiar with Marvel Comics, they've got, the antagonist is Namor the Submariner this time, who, of course, has a very complicated history in comics. Arguably been a hero, a villain, and an anti-hero at various times. But the first one, where you had Killmonger, who I think is their most fully realized villain they've probably ever had, where you are so much of the movie you find yourself with him. At least I was like, I really feel for this guy. You know, what he's saying is right. What he's saying about, you know, society is right. And even to an extent, you know, he's got a strong argument about what, you know, Black Panther should be doing about it. And he brings you right up to that edge. And then he either does something horrible, or he just somehow reminds you that he's actually a horrible person. And it knocks you way back on your heels. But then you start doing it again and you start feeling for the guy. So do you think Killmonger was an anti-hero, or was he just a sympathetic villain? Which I guess is, the next question.
I'd go for the second one, the latter.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess what I'm thinking is, I think of an anti-hero as the vehicle being built around that character. So in some ways, the character is inseparable from the film. And when I talk about Hannibal Lecter, it's no accident that he was the one that won the Academy Award. It really is a vehicle for Hannibal Lecter, I think, although Jodie Foster is fantastic in it. But to go back to Black Panther and where you started, I thought there were a lot of groundbreaking things about the first Black Panther movie. One was Wakanda itself. So that's amazing that it has technology and richness of culture that dwarf our own. And joined to the critique, how could you let African Americans in this country languish the way they have when you have that power and that force to change the world? And I thought using that critique of Wakanda took it to a level that I just thought was brilliant. So in terms of the anti-hero, I mean, by the end of that film, it's almost as though Wakanda itself is the anti-hero. It hasn't been doing good. It's been doing sort of limited, leave us alone and we'll flourish on our own kind of thing. Then at the very end of the film, Black Panther kind of commits to changing this, which I liked a lot. But, my real memory, my enduring memory is that that set of scenes where Wakanda, Black Panther are called out for not using the power that they have. We would say for good in the social justice sense, but it would have involved going to war with the rest of the world.
Interesting. So at least part of the line between an antihero and a sympathetic villain would be where they're centered in the narrative, where they are, where they live there.
Yeah, I think that's true most of the time. And in an average superhero movie, most superhero origin stories, there's the sense that the person is bullied, victimized, etc., and then they come into great power, and they're usually taught very quickly that they should use that power for good. They shouldn't become a bully in their own right. They shouldn't tyrannize over other people. And I think that remains a kind of enduring lens across the Marvel and DC universes. And within that, there's a lot of play. So you get, the Dark Knight series, where Batman is more brutal with his villains than traditionally. Actually, I guess that comes out of the 1970s and the Frank Miller influence at Marvel, among other things. But I really think that we have a undying, unquenchable thirst for people with heroic abilities who are misusing them to a certain extent in ways that we find gratifying.
Yeah. So, and I think of course, the other comic book then character that comes up while we're talking, I guess is an obvious one, is Magneto. You're talking about, he did have this, experience with the Holocaust, this horrible, dreadful to a degree most of us couldn't understand, but instead of being ennobled by it, he becomes the bad guy.
Yeah.
And he is often, at least in the movies and the comics, as much of a center of the story as, say, Professor X is. So he seems like he walks the line a little bit there.
Yeah.
He's been muhahaha, mustache twirling villain back in the old days. But since they gave him that Holocaust backstory, it does feel like we're supposed to be on his side a lot of the time.
Yeah, and he probably crosses over between the sympathetic villain and the anti-hero, but I think, Xavier is the focus. The X-Men are the focus. So at the end of the day, I think he's a sympathetic villain. It's funny, his scene where he tracks down the Nazis who, in Central America or South America, he tracks down the actual Nazis that I believe killed his mother. And he confronts them in a bar and tortures them with his powers. And that reminds me in a really direct way of Quentin Tarantino's, shtick, which is Quentin Tarantino finds someone that everyone would sort of agree is almost less than human. Nazis, the Sharon Tate murderers, Charles Manson gang in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. And then he amps up your animosity to those figures, and then he tortures them. And by torturing them, I think it crosses the line into what you might call torture porn. But also what he's doing is he's isolating what we're talking about, this identification with people who are misusing their power and, go get the Nazis. Yeah, do whatever you want to the Nazis. And then he says, okay, let's take a flamethrower and melt their face. How do you feel about that? And that's usually where audiences draw the line. So Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, I love the film. The last 15 minutes of it are very difficult to sit through for just that reason, because they call me out. They call the audience out. Oh, I thought you wanted to go in this direction where we would torture the Nazis or torture the Manson gang. So at the end of the day, I put it partially on Quentin Tarantino, partially on us.
Well, Quentin Tarantino does seem to lack some of the emotional circuit breakers, maybe that the the rest of us have. Here we go, and we're still going, and we're going farther. Well, you know, all of the various, the other part. I just throw this out so that I've said it. The other reason you hear from genre folks a lot this year about the anti-hero is Black Adam, which I would never recommend that you or anybody else spend any time on. But it is funny for those who have seen it. He actually sounds like a purer anti-hero than most. But there, I said it. It's out of the way. We don't ever have to talk about Black Adam or The Rock again. God bless your Rock. But favorite anti-heroes, best anti-heroes that you have encountered, literature, film. What are the ones you would point to in class and say, you want to learn about an anti-hero? Read this, watch this. I mean, you already mentioned Silence of the Lambs, so that was an awfully good go-to one because I didn't see that coming.
Well, I'll go with Harris and Silence of the Lambs, and then it becomes Hannibal, which I didn't like, but Silence of the Lambs and Red Dragon are just phenomenal, and mostly because of Hannibal Lecter. But if this is like the Hail Mary of all Hail Marys, if people out there have 3 weeks or a month and they're looking for a massive book to read from the 18th century, so this is 1749, 1747, Clarissa by Samuel Richardson. And Clarissa is the dawn of what we think of as the psychopath. So it's an epistolary novel. It's told in a series of letters, and it features a guy named Robert Lovelace, who is in love with a woman named Clarissa and decides he's going to possess her no matter what. And so he begins, he's vastly wealthy. He begins operating puppets, as he calls them, in her real life. So he pays people to pretend to be people in her real life to trap her into certain situations. So you'll go for 100 pages, 200 pages, thinking you understand what's going on. And then it will turn out that the town where Clarissa is populated almost exclusively with Lovelace's puppets. And they've been operating on her this whole time. It is the creepiest thing. And I think it touches off not only the modern novel, but the modern psychopath. So if you're looking for the origins of Hannibal Lecter, it's Robert Lovelace in Clarissa.
Damn. I am checking that out. That sounds...
Well, like I say, it's going to take you a month. It's a huge book.
Well, next time I have a free month.
Yeah.
Well, this has been a blast. I want to ask you, one more. You just got me thinking, I think I already know the answer to this, and I'm just asking for affirmation. The monster in the original Frankenstein, in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, is that a good example of an anti-hero or sympathetic villain? I
don't even think of the monster as a villain.
Mm-hmm.
At least in that book. I mean, in all of the spin-offs.
Well, he's a killer.
Yeah, but in the way that an animal is a killer. I think of him as a victim himself, a sympathetic victim, and obviously he's dangerous in the way that a wounded dog would be dangerous. But, I don't think of him as an anti-hero because he's not in control. He's reacting and receiving pain.
Choices are being made for him. He doesn't have enough agency to really.
Absolutely.
Okay. All right. Well, that's good. That was actually a much more interesting answer than I was expecting. All right. Well, I've already taken as much of your time as I promised I would, and I don't want to exploit you too much here. But this has been a blast.
Yeah, for me too. I love this stuff.
I'm back.
So Jim, what did you think of the conversation with Philip?
I thought it was very interesting. I got a lot out of it. I especially Clarissa. I'm going on vacation soon, and 700 page brick of a book is very appealing to me.
Yeah, I know, that sounded so interesting. I can't wait to get into it myself.
I know. I thought his points about antiheroes were very interesting and very well made. But what jumped out to me about them was, under his definition, Zack Snyder's Superman's an antihero. Right?
Really?
Because
You
like
think
you talk
so?
about,
Okay, you got to go into detail on that. I'm not seeing it.
you talk about superheroes who are bullied and come into great power and then eventually are mentored into using their powers for good. And that's not what, like, Superman was mentored into hiding, right?
Okay.
And I don't know. It just, like, it jumped out to me that this is like Man of Steel is not that, right?
Yeah. I see where you're going. I think you're emphasizing some points of his definition, maybe overemphasizing, but I hear what you're saying.
Maybe.
I get you. You know what, the reason, I harassed everyone to have this conversation, of course, as I saw so many of the reviews and reports on Wakanda Forever.
Yes, which I still haven't seen yet, so please don't.
Oh man!
No, you can spoil
see
it.
this, and we're having this conversation.
You can spoil it. It's fine. I have 2 children under 5. That's how it happened.
Well, Namor is been spoken of in a lot of the coverage. I'm sure you've seen it, the coverage as an anti-hero.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think you can realistically call him that movie. I think he's a sympathetic villain. And it just got me thinking, what do people mean by anti-heroes? And we aren't necessarily on the same page when we talk about that.
No, we're not. And I even think that the sympathetic villain definition is he's culturally important too. There's cultural context that changes someone from an anti-hero to a sympathetic villain, right? And I think the perfect example is the Punisher.
Yeah.
Right. The Punisher started out as a sympathetic villain. He swung to anti-hero in the 80s when that kind of, vigilante extreme murderer was seen as maybe backhandedly virtuous if he had a good reason for it.
Right.
And now he's all the way back around to, I don't even know if he's a sympathetic villain at this point.
Yeah. And when you miss that connective tissue there, where in the 90s, he became a full-on hero.
Right.
So he went from sympathetic villain to kind of anti-hero, just a hero. And now people are re-examining him again. So that's a really interesting case.
Right. Well, and Ennis, I think, treated him as a villain. But as a villain we could root for, like I think not even as a sympathetic villain, because I don't think that even the funny stuff, right? Even the Ennis Dillon, Welcome Back Frank stuff. Frank wasn't a good guy. Frank wasn't especially sympathetic. He was just kind of a force of nature in the background who would occasionally punch a bear in the face. Right.
So one character that I keep coming back to and wondering how they fit into this is Rorschach, right? Who is nominally a hero. We meet him. He's repulsive. You don't like him. You don't like the idea of him succeeding. But then at the end of the story, he's the one who tugs at your heartstrings, right? He's the one you feel for. So he's got I felt jerked around by that story emotionally so much. It was and it was largely because of that character. But where do you place him in this context?
I think that I think he's mentally ill and the Greek chorus of the story, right?
Yeah.
I think
Except he wasn't separated like a Greek chorus. He was very much a part of it. In fact, he became the heart and the soul of it in a sense.
I tend to read, and it's been a while since I really did a hard, close read of Watchmen. But I tend to think of Rorschach as an early manifestation of Alan Moore's problems with fanboys.
Oh, that's interesting.
Right? Because like Rorschach's the one screaming, that's not the way it's supposed to be. That's not how any of this is supposed to work.
Mm-hmm.
And he gets atomized for it and proven wrong, because as far as we know at the end of that story, Ozymandias saved the world.
But he doesn't get proven wrong, because his message lingers, and that's the seed to something's going to happen next, and it's going to be coming from this guy, and it's going to be good.
You could read it like that, sure, but you can also read it as a closed loop. And it's so hard to peel out all of the distinct layers of Watchmen, right? The commentary on the comics form, and Watchmen's diary functioning as to be continued on in a finite story. I think is you can't pull that out of the reading that this is that everyone in Watchmen is basically an anti-hero, right? I mean, Dr. Manhattan is atomizing people to protect Ozymandias's mass slaughter of New Yorkers.
Right, but then we have our underperforming heroes filling out the rest of the cast,
who are complicit in it at the end of the day.
And Rorschach isn't. So does that make him an anti-hero?
I think they all are, to a certain extent, right? I mean, if you want to slap labels on it, there's nobody in that story who's clean.
Mm-hmm.
There's different levels of sociopathy.
Sociopathy? What's the
sociopathy?
I don't know. We're talking about this, and I'm going through every body I can think of, who we might call anti-heroes in comics, or at least in, comics that have gone on forever, like Marvel and DC. And I go back to Magneto. I think of Magneto. I think of Namor, who's gone through every possible permutation. Mm-hmm. And I come back to Black Adam too, who's a great example, I think, in a lot of ways. But he wasn't always, but he is. So, it's like the reverse of the Nolan Batman thing, where if you live long enough to see yourself become the villain. And it's like, no, all these villains in comics, if they live long enough, they end up seeing themselves become the hero.
I think if they're an interesting and worthwhile villain, then there is always going to be a tendency to make them behave heroically at some point, right? Like Doom saved the multiverse in Secret Wars, right? Mm-hmm. Dr. Octopus was actually a very capable and competent Spider-Man for a while.
Yeah, that's a good example of this whole thing. That's a great example.
Yeah, right? Like the Green Goblin, like even the Joker to a certain extent, he's not he gets his own books, right? He gets his own stories where he gets to be the hero of the story.
He hates Nazis.
Sure, but
no, it doesn't count.
Then he hung out with Gaddafi and beat a Robin to death in Libya. So
right.
I don't know. Also, that's not canon. That was an Injustice panel.
No, but there was you mean the Nazi thing?
Yeah.
Byrne also did it too.
Oh, did he really? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I think that every interesting villain really.
Oh, that wasn't canon either. Sorry. Anyways, two non-canon things. Never mind. You think you go on. I'm sorry. I cut you off. I had to correct myself.
The one I'm stuck on is Green Goblin.
Mm-hmm.
I can't think of a heroic turn for Norman.
I can't either. I thought you were about to tell me one, but I'm scratching my head.
I can't think of one. I mean, I'm going through the X-Men's Rogues Gallery, and even Apocalypse is full-on hero now. Juggernaut just wants to buy a nice cottage with Black Tom and settle down. Magneto, obviously, Magneto's an interesting one because I think he's another one who reflects the cultural time.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Magneto's heroic turn came under Claremont.
Yes.
And the addition of the Holocaust backstory made him not more relatable to a broader audience, but much more three-dimensional.
Well, he became a sympathetic villain.
He made it much easier for Claremont made it much easier for people to understand why Magneto would have the beliefs that he does and why he would fight the way that he does to protect those beliefs. And the way that Magneto fights to protect those beliefs is much more socially acceptable now than it was at any point in the 90s, right?
Right.
When, you know, the 90s and even the early 2000s, when kind of respectability politics ruled. So he's an interesting one, but I like all of the good X-Men villains. I mean, Sinister, right? Mr. Sinister's
he's never had a good streak in him at all.
Never had a good streak in him. He's always been a messy bitch.
Yeah. Well, and this, like I say, it's the ones that you have a continuing story that lasts long enough, because then there's all the other villains that, you know, that are one-offs or just, you know, plot devices for, you know, heroism, that are littering these comics that, you know, they never showed anything.
I would put Sinister in, actually, you know who's never really had a hero turn is Humans in X-Men comics, right? Omega Sentinel was good for a little while.
Wait, what do you, by humans? You mean like a human being?
No, I mean not specific humans. I mean humans as a species.
Oh, okay. I was going to say there's some specific humans, but
there are specific humans. There are the good ones, but they are by and large the ones that are sicking the Sentinels on the Xavier Mansion, right? Or they're the ones that are bombing a bus full of students at the school, wearing their, you know, power armor with the smiley face on the outside.
So are X-Men comics a decades-long exercise in self-loathing? That's what you're saying.
Yeah. I mean, or cultural critique, right?
Right.
Like a bunch of white people telling other white people stop being assholes.
Right. Well, I don't know that we've come to any great milestones here. What have we learned? Like,
we've learned that antiheroes are culturally dependent and are fascinating to people because of the depth.
Right.
You know, I think we did 5 minutes on Watchmen. We could have done 3 decades on Watchmen.
Yeah.
Still not come to any conclusions about it, but we could have examined it from a million different directions and discovered just how anti-heroic all of those characters were at the various points in the story.
I feel like one thing we've at least maybe figured out is that these villains that start off villainous that end up being heroes, it's a transition that we see in a lot of these characters, and maybe there's this point in between that you can grab where they're at the anti-hero moment, the anti-hero stage. Well, and that's a sweet spot.
I think any transition from villain to sympathetic villain to hero, there is an anti-hero stop, right? Because there is a point in time where they are trying to maintain consistency with their old lives, but their heroic urges are pulling them in a different direction. So you get that conflict, right? I think that any villain that's developed sufficiently to engender sympathy from an audience is that like the next step, because people want to see the best in themselves, and people see themselves in the media that they consume, right? So the next step is to, you know, once they're sympathetic, the next step is to actually make them good, because the people that see themselves in those characters want to be good themselves.
Right. But the anti then lives in that transitional period, really, right in between.
Yep.
And that's where you can find some of the best writing, honestly, I think.
Because of the depth. Yeah. That's what we learned today. There we go.
There you go. We learned
We
about
did it.
depth.
Congratulations, everybody. Good work.
All right. So I guess that's it. Thanks everybody for listening. We'll be back next time with something.
Somebody figure something out. We'll do it.
All right.